Thanks to the Africa Center for the opportunity to be here this morning. I just wanted to offer a few comments, and I've written far more in the research paper, so I'll try not to repeat the entire thing here, but I think a few things that are worth highlighting as we think forward, how South Sudan can come out of its current moment of crisis, and what we might look for a framework in terms of priorities for the medium term here. To start, I just note that while the messiness of South Sudan's transition is not a surprise and is, in fact, to be expected to some extent, the current crisis and scale of violence in South Sudan is the direct result of the absence of institutional alternatives to manage political competition, given the failure of its leadership, namely President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar. And it's this failure to avoid resorting to violence to settle their political differences in the absence of institutions. The country, however, is not doomed to years of instability and conflict. Progress can be made during a transitional period toward a new political dispensation, given responsible leadership and inclusive processes. While escaping cycles of violence is hard, empirical evidence tells us that it can be done. The World Bank's 2011 World Development Report captures the experiences of countries that have successfully exited from cycles of violence and provides a framework for prioritizing state building and reconstruction efforts in South Sudan, if and when the immediate fighting ends and a transitional political agreement is reached. It finds that, and I quote, "To break cycles of insecurity and reduce the risk of their recurrence, national reformers and their international partners need to build the legitimate institutions that can provide a sustained level of citizen security, justice, and jobs," end quote. Such institutional transformation, however, takes time. A best-case scenario is within a generation and requires first a restoration of confidence and trust in government and across communities. For South Sudan, it will be imperative to address the underlying issues of political accountability of the executive branch and the ruling political party that precipitated the outbreak of fighting, and to repair the damage to state-society relations and intercommunal relations that the violence has caused. For this to happen, the current political leadership faces a critical choice: to use the crisis to recommit itself to developing inclusive, accountable institutions by ceasing actions that perpetuate the dominance of the executive, or to continue to alienate society from the state through the pursuit of power. Neither Salva Kiir nor Riek Machar is indispensable to a stable, peaceful, democratic South Sudan, but either one can doom it to decades more death and destruction. Courageous leadership is required to rise above personal ambitions and animosities, to embrace mechanisms and processes that can generate renewed confidence in the state and ultimately systems that can endure. Such accountability mechanisms can be state-based, such as constitutions, elections, legislatures, courts, political parties, subnational government, a merit-based civil service, a professional security sector, among others. They can also be society-based, for instance, having an independent media and access to information, a robust civil society, deep social capital, and the support of external norms and standards. The development of any particular mechanism is somewhat less important than the density or the layering of these mechanisms across the state and society. Sadly, the government's record since independence is one of deliberate undermining and erosion of accountability mechanisms between state and society. This is the root of the current crisis and the fundamental issue that must be addressed once the fighting ends. Political leadership that is serious about restoring confidence in the state and ending cycles of violence would dedicate itself to building more inclusive coalitions to support key institutional reforms, to expanding space for independent voices so as to enable a national dialogue, and to realizing tangible successes to demonstrate the state's responsiveness to citizen expectations during this moment of political transition, particularly with respect to drafting a permanent constitution, fostering national and local reconciliation, and conducting fair and peaceful elections. Let me say just a little bit more about each. To begin with, the state needs to make a far more concerted and genuine effort to build collaborative partnerships beyond the class of elites who have dominated South Sudan's political arena thus far. The partnership building process must also transcend societal fault lines and engage youth. By partnering with trusted institutions in society, such as churches and non-governmental and civil society organizations, identifying mutually beneficial priorities and complementary strengths, such a strategy would improve the government's engagements with local communities. This would simultaneously diminish the justification for violence by communities that feel they have been excluded from the political process. Whether it involves matters of security, political processes, development needs, or other issues, the practice of building inclusive coalitions would make initiatives and reforms more viable, more sustainable, more effective, while fostering trust for future state-building efforts. Beyond actively cultivating coalitions and inclusivity, the state must also protect space for citizens and communities to express themselves if the processes of a state-society dialogue are to gain traction. Access to independent information is indispensable to establishing accountability mechanisms on which a stable, democratic, developmental state depends. Rather than trying to monopolize state-society relations, the government and the SPLM should recognize independent civil society actors as representing authentic perspectives of citizens that can contribute to a stronger and more stable South Sudan. Harassing, intimidating, or otherwise inhibiting these voices sends exactly the opposite message, that the state does not want a genuine discussion with its citizens and intends to continue to dominate access to power and wealth. The outcome of such an approach is perpetual resistance and instability. And since the challenge of building a national consciousness is as much a cultural exercise as it is a political one, efforts to foster a new South Sudanese identity should complement reforms to protect and expand political and civil rights. South Sudan's heterogeneity provides deep reservoirs of culture that, if appreciated and respected for their diversity, can foster a new national identity. Ultimately, the government needs to demonstrate that it has the interests of its citizens at heart. Current facts on the ground do not bear this out. To change this, a period of political transition is needed during which inclusive processes will matter as much as the outcomes generated, for this signals how committed the government is to citizen participation and input. 4 strategic priorities are imperative to restore legitimacy to the state so that vital institutional reforms in security, justice, and livelihoods can proceed. First, the current transitional constitution gives extraordinary powers to the president with almost no checks afforded to other branches of government. The president cannot be impeached. He can dismiss the national and state assemblies and remove state governors from office, as well as any justice or judge. A national constitutional review process was to have been completed by January of 2013, leading to a final permanent constitution soon thereafter. Even before the violence broke out, the review process was woefully behind schedule, raising serious questions about the adoption of a new permanent constitution before the current terms of the President and the National Assembly expire in 2015. The National Constitutional Review process should be an opportunity to educate citizens about what a constitution is and solicit their views about what kinds of checks and balances the people of South Sudan want on their government. Instead, the path provided for in the transitional constitution seems set to replicate the ruling party's vision for how it should govern the country. It also leaves the product forever open to serious challenges of its legitimacy. In light of the current crisis, the timeline for adopting a new permanent constitution and conducting national elections will need to be revised further. These are critical issues that need to be resolved in the negotiations on the political transition. There is an opportunity to make this process more inclusive, participatory, and transparent. Most importantly, the draft constitution should be put to a popular referendum to demonstrate societal commitment while significantly boosting the legitimacy of the state. An open and legitimate constitutional review process represents the most significant opportunity for South Sudan to lay an enduring foundation for national unity. A closed and exclusive process, however, will result in extended political grievances and perceptions of injustice. It will also seriously call into question the political leadership's commitment to democracy. Second, an integrated process of national reconciliation, truth-telling, and justice is needed to help drive progress towards citizen security and justice, as Jacques has just mentioned. These are two critical requirements for ending the violence. Although not mandated in the CPA or in the Transitional Constitution, the government announced in early 2013 an initiative for a national reconciliation process in recognition of the country's long history of intercommunal fighting and grievances. The further deterioration of intercommunal relations and new grievances spawned by the current fighting renders this initiative of utmost importance. Although delayed by early disagreements over the Reconciliation Committee's mandate and membership, a new Committee of National Healing, Peace, and Reconciliation, led by church leaders, was established in April 2013. It is imperative that the process be kept apolitical and managed by independent and trusted non-state institutions, given the roles of many of the senior political leaders, not just in the current crisis, but in the long history of South-South violence. Ensuring every community has an opportunity to air its grievances will be vital to the credibility of the process, and the difficult question of whether and what forms of justice will be administered in response to the findings of the reconciliation dialogue comprises another significant challenge for the committee, for political leadership, and for the South Sudanese society at large. This question must be answered in South Sudan. Third, the political transition should make preparations for elections, but these should not proceed without first restoring some confidence in the country's political processes. Specifically, there should be first a credible and participatory process to draft and adopt a new permanent constitution, as I've just said, and the adoption of internal SPLM party reforms to restore democratic procedures and transparent vetting and selection of candidates for office. There should also be the provision of space for other political parties to organize and develop their capacities, and progress on national reconciliation and healing should precede elections. Without progress in these areas first, electoral contests will continue to be seen as winner-take-all competitions that heighten the likelihood of violence. Finally, these critical processes all depend on the movement of people, goods, services, and information across the country. In a territory the size of Texas, there is only one paved highway running roughly 120 miles from the capital Juba to the Ugandan border, and this was constructed by USAID. Huge swaths of the country remain inaccessible by road during rainy seasons, including the most conflict-stricken regions. South Sudan's sheer lack of physical infrastructure will continue to be a severe obstacle to every political, security, economic, humanitarian, and development objective for the country. Roads and radio coverage must be extended to every region of South Sudan as quickly as possible. So long as communities remain cut off from each other and from the government, physically and through the exchange of information, insecurity and political exclusion will persist. To conclude, a period of political transition is needed to generate renewed confidence in the state and to provide the social capital needed to build the institutions most central to preventing a recurrence of the current crisis, those of citizen security, justice, and livelihoods. Most immediately, the fighting must end, political detainees must be released, humanitarian aid must reach all needy populations, and human rights abuses must be accounted for. The United States and the international community should deploy all diplomatic measures available to them to impress these priorities upon President Kiir and Riek Machar, both of whom are culpable for the devastation and suffering wrought by nearly 2 months of fighting. Going forward, South Sudan's leadership can set a new course toward legitimacy, stability, and sustained development if it prioritizes, above all, building trust, accountability, and social cohesion with and across the South Sudanese population. There is no more essential state-building task than this. As the current crisis so tragically illustrates, the foundation of the state cannot be an afterthought. Thank you.